And that's what we're going to focus in on today, the silent killer of growth. And you could do all the right things. You could read the Bible, you could be connected in church, you could be giving and serving, but if this silent killer is present, it has the power to destroy your faith journey. So that's what we're going to look at. We're going to journey through 1 Kings chapter 12, and I want to read this story, and then I'm going to unpack it as we look at this concept. 1 Kings chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, it says this: Rehoboam went to Shechem, for all Israel had gone there to make him king. Now, I want to stop and pause for a moment. This is about 1,000 years before Jesus comes. Rehoboam is the son of Solomon. So Solomon, wise king. It's noted that he's been the wisest person to ever live aside from Jesus. And Solomon's son is now going to take the baton of leadership after Solomon's death. It says, when Jeroboam, son of Nebat, heard this, he was still in Egypt, where he had fled from King Solomon. He returned from Egypt. So they sent for Jeroboam, and he and the whole assembly of Israel went to Rehoboam and said this to him: Your father put a heavy yoke on us, but now lighten the load of harsh labor and the heavy yoke he put on us, and we will serve you. Rehoboam answered, Go away for 3 days and then come back to me. So the people went away. Now, here in this story, you've got Rehoboam and Jeroboam, two very similar names. And Rehoboam, who is Solomon's son, is the new king. But this guy by the name of Jeroboam had had a conflict with Solomon, and he had left and fled to Egypt. So Solomon didn't like Jeroboam, Jeroboam didn't like Solomon. But when he hears Rehoboam's leading, he comes back. And so this question comes to Rehoboam: hey, will you lighten the load that your father put on us as a people? So he says to them, go away, 3 days, come back, I'm going to give you an answer. And then in verse 6 it says, Then King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served his father Solomon during his lifetime. What would you advise me to answer to these people? He asked. And they replied, If today you will be a servant to these people and serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. If you will lighten the load, if you'll love them, if you'll serve them, they will follow you, Rehoboam. But Rehoboam rejected the advice of the elders and consulted with the young men who had grown up with him and were serving with him. He asked them this question: What is your advice? How should we answer these people who say to me, lighten the yoke your father put on us? Now the young men who had grown up with him replied, These people have said to you, your father put a heavy yoke on us, but make our yoke lighter. Now tell them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father laid on you a heavy yoke. I will make it even heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. Now that's a threat right there. Scorpions. If you ever been bitten by one, it doesn't feel too nice. So then it says 3 days later, Jeroboam and all the people returned to Rehoboam, as the king had said, come back to me in 3 days. And the king answered the people harshly, rejecting the advice given to him by the elders. He followed the advice of the young men and said, My father made your yoke heavy. I will make it heavier. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. So the king did not listen to the people, for this turn of events was from the Lord to fulfill the word the Lord had spoken to Jeroboam, son of Nebat, through Ahijah the Shilonite. Now, this is a very significant moment in the history of Israel, because what happens from this point forward is that Israel is never a unified nation again. The 12 tribes of Israel, they are separate from one another after this, and the kingdom is torn in two. Through one decision made by one king, it has a ripple effect across generations to come. And I want you for a moment just to imagine these conversations. So Rehoboam, he has to make a very significant decision in the first few moments of his leadership. How is he going to approach caring for the people? Will he lighten the load, or will he increase the load? And these two voices are in the back of his head. So undoubtedly, there was a moment where Rehoboam went and sat at some table with the elders. They're all around the table, these wise guys who've consulted with Solomon, the wisest man who's ever lived, and now they give consult to Rehoboam. He would have heard that wisdom and then got up from that table and went to another table where his buddies were gathered. And as he sat around that table, they gave him counsel, and now he follows through, and it's destructive as a result. Now, you and I sit at all different types of tables. You know, if you could just imagine, there are tables that you sit at with your family, maybe for mealtime. There are tables that you sit at work, maybe during lunch at work or during meetings. There are tables that you sit at perhaps in your neighborhood. But there are different tables that we find ourselves placed at. And most of the tables that we sit at, they are tables that we don't get to choose who's around the table. Like, you know, you don't really get to choose your siblings, for good or for bad. You don't get to choose who your parents are. You don't get to choose who are all the people that your boss puts around you at work unless you are the boss. See, there are so many tables that we find ourselves that we don't get to choose, but there's one table that we do get to choose, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. It's called the wisdom table. You and I have a wisdom table that is influencing our lives, and this is a definition. Your wisdom table is the combination of voices that you are currently letting speak into your life. These voices are around the table. Some of them are more prominent than others. They could be friends, they could be mentors, they could be podcasts, they could be TikTok videos, they could be all different types of things that we listen to, but they're the voices that shape our lives, that shape how we think, that impact our hearts and the course of our life. So here's the secret killer of growth that oftentimes is underneath the surface and we don't see it until it's too late. The secret killer of growth is when you have the wrong people at your wisdom table. It's when you have the wrong voices speaking into the trajectory of your life. And you know, I think back when I was in high school, and I don't know if anybody else did anything dumb in high school. I did quite a few dumb things, but there were always 2 or 3 friends involved. It's like never like a teenager loses his brain and he does it alone. Well, maybe sometimes, but very rarely. Usually they look and they say, somebody was with me. Somebody told me one time, 1 teenage boy, 1 brain, 2 teenage boys, half a brain, 3 teenage boys, no brain. And so there's always a group of friends that are involved. And this wisdom table, a good friend of mine actually wrote a book called Bring It Out. His name's Ben Pilgreen. Encourage you to read the book. He introduced this concept. And I love this concept because it's helped me on a personal level really to think through the decisions of who are the people that are shaping my life. So there are relationships that we have that are casual work relationships. There are people in our neighborhood that we interact with, or maybe when you drop your kids off at school. But there is another level of influence when you let somebody pull up and take a seat in your life, and now you're listening to their voice as a dominant voice of direction for your life. So I want to set some principles around why this is so important and how perhaps this thing under the surface could be destroying the work of God in your life and what we can do about it today. So I have 3 ideas around the wisdom table. First of all, your wisdom table is framing your perspective. It's changing the way that you see the world. And Solomon, actually in the Old Testament, who was Rehoboam's dad, even the wisest man who ever lived could turn to folly at the end of his life. And I want you to see how all of this is playing out because the wrong voices started to shape him and then eventually started to shape King Rehoboam. And if you'll notice in verse 6 and 7, King Rehoboam consulted the elders who had served Solomon, his father, during his lifetime. How would you advise me to answer these people? And they replied, today, if you will be a servant leader, if you will serve them and give them a favorable answer, they will always be your servants. So this wisdom actually prior to the end of Solomon's life had shaped the way that Solomon lived and led. And that leadership or that wisdom is framing even this servant leadership concept that would lead to life if Rehoboam had responded to it. So you have a perspective and I have a perspective on the world, and there are voices that are coming into that perspective that we're making a choice to listen to. And there's no innocent scrolling on your phone. You might think that you're just simply watching a video on your phone with 30 seconds on TikTok or Instagram, and that video that you're watching is getting into your mind and shaping the way that you think. The same is true with the music that we listen to. Parents, this is so crucial and important that our children's brains are being shaped by the lyrics that are getting into their minds. And I'll give you just an example of this. We've had times where our kids will be listening to a song, and I'll just stop and I'll say, I would never let those words be spoken in our house, but I'm letting them right into my children's brains with what they're listening to through their headphones. And the encouragement is to say, wait, pause. That's framing the way that you see the world. So every song you listen to, every podcast that we play when we're driving down the road, every book that we read, that we're infusing into our souls, into our minds, a perspective that is shaping the way that we live. And it's so important for us to come back and say, we want a different perspective. We want God's perspective. Proverbs 15:22 says, plans fail for a lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they will succeed. Plans fail with the wrong counsel. So there's a worldview that is shaping our thoughts and our minds, and the word is contrary to what the world teaches. And these two worldviews are colliding. So I want the worldview of the word to be in my mind more than the world's worldview is in my mind. And this happens by putting the right people and the right voices around the table. The second thing that happens is it shapes our hearts. So your wisdom table is shaping your heart. And you'll see Solomon in 1 Kings chapter 11, verse 4, the moment where Solomon starts to get off. It says, as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his heart after other gods. He had 700 wives, friends. That sounds miserable right there. One wife is enough, baby. One knife. That's all. That's all. And so Solomon had these 700 wives that over time his heart drifted to false gods. And his heart became in a different place, different condition. It was not fully devoted to the Lord as his heart, the heart of David, his father, had been. So the wisest man to ever live died a fool because of who was around his wisdom table. Now think about that for just a moment. No matter how much intelligence you have, no matter how long you've walked with God, if you get the wrong people shaping your heart, it will cause you to erode and shipwreck your life. So the invitation is to have a different table and to have a kind of voice that leads to life. So shaping our heart. I also want us to come back to these young men and the way that they're calling Rehoboam to this hard attitude of arrogance. My father scourged you with whips. I will scourge you with scorpions. And what I've seen from my own journey is that sometimes it doesn't have to be old or young. It's not an age thing. It's a wisdom thing. I want to say that again. There are young people who are 27 years old and they live with wisdom. And there are 68-year-old people who live like fools. And there are 80-year-old men who are wise and 35-year-old. You guys get the point of what I'm saying. It's everything in between. And what I have noticed is that there's been moments in my life where I've gotten around some friends, maybe that are frustrated, bitter, entitled. And then I started to notice that the more I hung out with this certain group of friends, the more frustrated, entitled, and bitter I started to feel myself. And if you'll notice, hard attitudes have a way of catching. They're contagions. So entitlement in somebody else's heart that you let in, it leads to entitlement in your heart. And when you find yourself getting bitter, you may find yourself next to a bitter person. The same is true on the flip side when you get around one person who has bold faith and believes there's nothing that God cannot do, then that kind of faith influences your heart as well. So your wisdom table is shaping your heart. If you want to have a different heart, you need different people around the table influencing the trajectory of your life. I know a man ultimately that was deeply impacted by the people around his table. And what happened to him was not only was his heart shifted, but as his heart changed, the third thing that happened to him was that his destiny got off track. And your table is determining your destiny at the same time. I want to say this very clearly. The people around your table, as they influence your heart, they're changing the destiny of your life. Now, let me tell you the story of this guy. So earlier in ministry, I met this guy. He He wasn't a follower of Jesus when I started spending time with him. He made a decision to follow Jesus. After he made a decision to follow Jesus, we started reading the Bible together. He started growing. He got involved in the church where we were at the time. He started serving there. As he was serving there, he started sensing a call to ministry. He met a girl. He married her. Stacy and I got to be a part of their wedding. It was a beautiful day. And then over time, as this couple moved along, they made a decision to move to another state. We kind of lost track with them. And then a few years later, the wife of the family calls Stacy and I and says, hey, he's in a really bad spot right now. And I'm wondering if there's anything that you could do just to talk to him and see if you can get him back. So he'd made a decision to move out. He wanted nothing to do with his wife or his son. So I called this guy on the phone and I was like, bro, you're about to train wreck your life. You're walking away from your marriage. You're walking away from your son. Is this the legacy that you want to have for your life? And then as he unpacked where he had gotten himself into, I asked him, tell me about how you got to this place, because I know you were in love with her. I know you were committed. I did your wedding ceremony and heard your vows. And he shared with me how there was one person from his past that he started talking to. This one person was on his third marriage and was giving him counsel for his marriage. That should be a clue right there. Third marriage, ruined 3 of them, and now he's going to give counsel and advice to this young man. And his heart over time, his perspective over time shifted to now he destroyed the destiny of his whole lineage because there was a voice that was impacting him deep at a soul level. So one voice has the power to destroy your life or help build your life. On the contrary, I can think of so many mentors along the way that have had deposits and wisdom, and my life has been shifted because those deposits and the wisdom. So the question we've got to wrestle through is, what trajectory are the voices in our life pointing us towards? So your feet are pointed in a direction based upon the voices that are behind you and seated at your table. And what can happen is, if we're not careful, we find ourselves drifting. And Proverbs 13:20 describes how we get out of that. It says, walk with the wise and become wise, for a companion of fools suffers harm. So when I have fools around my table of wisdom, I find myself suffering harm. So how do I change that?